So a common move in political and moral argumentation is to reframe support for one ideal or one value as opposition to some alternative ideal or value. I think we see a lot of this in popular discourse, in newspapers, in political rhetoric. I'll give you two examples. One of these is maybe has more salience for people in the United States, but hopefully it will make sense. So when Black Lives Matter protesters in the US, so this is a sort of loosely knit social group in the US that emerged about a decade ago, but became especially influential during the 2020 COVID lockdowns, when there were these mass protests in the US against a murder that had been committed by a Minneapolis police officer against a black man, who he sort of restrained by choking, and which eventually led to his death. Anyway, there were these mass protests under the slogan Black Lives Matter. And the Black Lives Matter activists present themselves as arguing against discrimination, racism, and police brutality against black people. But a common move among their political opponents was to claim that their real motivation is to say that white lives or non-black lives do not matter. So we have this claim, Black Lives Matter, and the accusation is what you really mean is that white lives don't matter, or that black lives matter more than white lives. Another example is that when environmental groups sometimes present themselves as arguing for the protection of the natural world, some of their opponents will claim that they're better described as opposed to development or progress or freedom. We hear a lot of rhetoric like this on the political right in the US, for example, and also in Europe, I think. So those claims have the following form. I call this claim negative orientation. The general form of those claims is that although you claim to value one thing, call it X, what you actually value is something else, call it Y, where you're more accurately described as disvaluing Y rather than valuing X. And I take it that that kind of claim sometimes is true and sometimes is false. So let me give you an example of what I think is a clear case in which that kind of claim is true. So this is a long example because I want to give it some detail and I want us to think about it. So this is the example in your handout that I call this guy Alan. So imagine this guy Alan who feels underappreciated, gloomy, alone. Imagine he's failed in his attempts to spark romantic relationships. He has no close friends at work or outside of work, and he fantasizes about other lives in which he's more appreciated and valued and loved and has closer connections. And imagine that he's envious of those who do have those things. So he sees that other people do enjoy close friendships and romantic relationships and so forth, and he feels envious of that. So he feels that his life is in many respects a failure, and this negatively impacts his self-conception. So he has a fairly negative view of himself. But in time, as he's browsing the internet, he stumbles upon incel websites, and reading the incel ideology, he comes to believe that his plight is not his fault, but is instead traceable to social perversions. So the incel websites, and I take it that many of you are familiar with these, but I'll say more about them a bit later. The incel websites teach him that many men are in his plight, they're sort of adrift and alone, because they're unjustly denied esteem from women. And the incel ideology identifies women and feminism as the two main sources of problem in the social world. That ideology represents women as biologically determined to be shallow and superficial and purely interested in things like physical appearance and wealth and so forth, and to be prone to engaging in manipulation and coercion so as to secure those sorts of goods. And women are presented as powerful in that they force men to seek those sorts of goods, those material goods and so forth, in order to secure sex and esteem. So according to these incel websites, the modern social norms force men into a couple of paths, all of which are in various ways unappealing. First, men can choose to be authentic individuals who eschew the superficial goods and refuse to compromise on their autonomy and their true interests, but they'll then be in Alan state. They'll be gloomy and alone and unappreciated, not enjoying social esteem. Or men can attempt to bend their desires to superficial goods and allow themselves to be manipulated by women, in which case they secure esteem, but according to incel, we'll call them chads. We'll use these derogatory terms to explain that. Or they can take a third way. They can oppose that state of affairs, instead attempting to sort of shift the social norms and return to this putatively golden age in which women married early, feminism wasn't around, men held social power, and so forth. So Alan encounters that ideology and imagine that he finds it extremely congenial. It traces what might otherwise be experienced as his personal failings to these widespread social problems. And it gives him a target to demean and disparage and resent, namely women and feminist views. And those are the people that he can see as responsible for his unfortunate plight. So gradually adopting that ideology, he comes to think of himself more positively. He comes to value a form of imagined patriarchy in which men like him enjoy unimpeded access to sex and esteem. And, he might, in virtue of adopting this new ideology, he might come to describe his values in positive terms. He might say that what he really values is something like men's rights or autonomy, something that looks like a positive characterization of a value. But going back to that negative orientation claim, I think that what a lot of us would want to say about him is that despite his claim to value autonomy or to value men's rights, he's more accurately described as valuing something else, disvaluing something else, that is. He's more accurately described as disvaluing women and feminism. So I think that's our initial inclination, to describe him as having negative values, despite his possible protests to the contrary. I think that's intuitively what seems right. And I think that contrasts with the way that we would be inclined to describe a lot of environmentalists or Black Lives Matter activists. So I gave you those examples at the start of the talk, and I think that often, my personal reaction when I hear Trump disparaging Greta Thunberg, or when I hear people like Tucker Carlson disparaging Black Lives Matter activists, claiming that they don't really value this positive thing, but instead value this negative thing, I'm inclined to think that's false, right? So it seems like there's a contrast between cases in which it's true that although someone purports to value something, they're actually better described as disvaluing something else, and then there are cases in which that seems to be mere rhetoric, in which the claim seems to be false. And I think that that sort of claim, although it seems, at least to me, intuitively obvious, and I hope to you as well, I think it's actually quite difficult to make sense of that claim. So it can be quite difficult to pin down what it would even mean to say that that negative orientation claim is either true or false of a particular individual. I'll talk about some difficulties with that in the first part of the talk. But before doing that, I want to point out that it's not really just in these individual cases of accusations about whether Black Lives Matter activists or environmentalists are negatively oriented that that kind of claim emerges. I think lately there's been a huge amount of talk in newspapers, in news programs, in philosophical literature, in intellectual literature generally, that claims that we are in an age of grievance politics, or the politics of resentment. And I think when you try to cash out what those claims mean, one thing that you're going to very quickly encounter is the need to appeal to something like that negative orientation claim, to appeal to something like the claim that although people claim to be valuing one thing, they're better described as disvaluing something else. So I think this claim is quite widely implicated in social and intellectual discourse, but it's actually quite puzzling and quite hard to make sense of. And this talk is going to be an attempt to make sense of that claim. So I want to start out just by noting 4 quick problems with that claim. So this is on your handout. So intuitively, if we want to draw this difference between either values, or as I'll later be talking about, people's identities being rooted in negative disvaluations rather than positive valuations, it looks like we're straight away going to run into a couple of problems. One of the problems is that although it might initially be tempting to think that we can draw that distinction by appealing to the causal history, the ideology of the evaluative judgment, it looks like that's not going to work. It looks like we can pretty quickly generate some counterexamples to that. So if you think about the Allen example, the Allen incel example, if you want to specify why we might be tempted to describe him as negatively oriented, one thing that might come to mind is the causal history of the way in which he acquires those anti-feminist and anti-woman evaluations, right? We can appeal to the sort of sense of malaise or dissatisfaction and all these other factors that then give rise to his embracing of that ideology. Those values seem to be formed in this hateful manner and seem to be rooted in a desire to assuage these feelings of impotence or disaffection or something like that. So we might think that's enough, but I think that doesn't work, because I think we can get cases in which values do start out in a way that's manifesting hatred or disaffection or some kind of negative stance, but nonetheless come to be properly described as positively oriented. So I give you a quick example on the handout here. I won't read through this in great detail, but the idea is just something like this. Imagine, here's a common scenario, at least in American high schools. There's like a dominant social clique that is popular and enjoys esteem within the high school that's centered around, let's say, athletic success. And imagine somebody who's not athletic and doesn't have a lot of social graces, and as a result feels excluded and pushed aside, doesn't get the esteem of her classmates. And imagine that she reactively and negatively picks something that the dominant social clique does not value, and she decides to value that. Let's say that thing is art, so rather than valuing athletic pursuits, as the people in her high school do, she turns to art. Imagine that at first, that really is just reactive and negative. I think anybody who's familiar with high school students, at least in the US, knows that a lot of the valuations really do seem to be formed, at least initially, in this sort of reactive manner, where people define themselves in terms of what they're against, rather than in terms of what they're for. I think we can imagine somebody coming to value art originally in that way, but then imagine if this becomes a realm that actually interests her, a realm that exercises some of her talents and abilities, so that gradually, as she's drawn ever deeper into artistic appreciation, she comes to value art for its own sake. She no longer cares so much about rejecting the opposed group, but instead cares about art for its own sake. I think that's an entirely coherent possibility, where you're drawn in to some realm of value in this negative reactive manner, but then as time goes by, you come to value that stuff for its own sake. So it's at least conceptually possible that Alan, or somebody drawn into the incel ideology, could be like that. I'll introduce some complications later on, but it seems true that even if somebody is drawn into a realm of putative value in this reactive, resentful way, nonetheless, as time goes by, those initial emotions or psychological states or affects that drew them into it could fade and be replaced by something else, such that they're no longer engaged in this reactive mode of evaluation. So I think for that reason, by appealing to the causal history of the evaluative judgments, we can't get that kind of distinction that's embodied in the negative orientation claim. I also think we can't get it in another way that might seem initially tempting. So if I ask you why Alan, who embraces the incel ideology, seems negatively oriented, and let's say Alice, who values art, seems positively oriented, then an obvious answer would be that you look at the contents of the evaluative judgments. So Alan embraces a bunch of judgments like women are disvaluable, feminism is pernicious, things of that sort. The artistic judgments that art is valuable are not going to usually be expressed in that sort of way, right? So you might think that we can just look at the contents of those evaluative judgments and draw the distinction that way. But again, I think that can't work, and I think you can see why it can't work by considering that Alice art example. Alice has what becomes a positive evaluative judgment in terms of its content, that art is valuable, but that's originally, in the early moments of her transition to valuing that thing, held in a reactive, resentful manner. So it looks like, and I'll give you some more examples of this later on, but it looks like you can hold the very same content, the very same evaluative content, in either a positive or negative manner. So it's not going to be by appealing to the content of the evaluative judgment that we can get that sort of distinction. It's also not going to be by thinking about what you're committed to opposing. So one thing that's going to be interesting about values, I think, is that any evaluative judgment coupled with certain sorts of factual beliefs is going to entail certain kinds of oppositional stances. So take something that looks perfectly fine as value. Suppose I think that autonomy is valuable, and suppose we couple that with the claim that a certain person or group of people is undermining or opposing autonomy. It looks like I'm going to be committed to trying to counteract that, or perhaps even to interact in some sort of negative fashion with those people. So it looks like, valuing something involves wanting to preserve or sustain or promote that thing, and when that thing is under threat, it looks like you're going to be committed to certain kinds of negative stances toward the thing that threatens the object of your evaluation. So it looks like any value is going to entail certain kinds of negative reactions. And finally, you might think that one big difference between Alan and Alice, Alan embracing the incel ideology and Alice embracing the values of art, one difference that you might point to is that Alan's judgments are reprehensible or perhaps false, and Alice's are not, right? So Alice's seem perfectly fine, and depending on what you want to say about like the truth accessibility of evaluative claims, you might say that those are true. So Alan's evaluative judgments are oppressive or demeaning, and Alice's aren't. But the problem is that even that's not going to allow us to draw this negative-positive distinction, because it's possible to hold legitimate, non-reprehensible evaluative principles in a way that's expressive of hatred or contempt. So one example of this is, again, I hope this has some salience in the European context. This is a lot of salience in the US context. But I mentioned this Black Lives Matter movement, which aims to counteract widespread police brutality against black people in the US. When that movement arose, I pointed out that a lot of conservative politicians and media began to claim that the real motivation was to claim that white lives don't matter. But there was also this sort of counter movement called White Lives Matter. Now, it's true, if we just look at that claim, it is, of course, true that white lives matter. My life matters. Many of the people in this room are white. Your lives matter. So it's, of course, that's a true, non-reprehensible evaluative judgment that white lives matter. However, if you look at the way that that claim functioned in the discourse on the right, many of those claims were expressed in a way that seems to be a clear case of what I was calling negative orientation. So let me give you a few quotes. So there are two people who claim to have founded White Lives Matter. Both of them are neo-Nazis, but one of them is named Rebecca Barnett, and she says things like this. One of her quotes is, in 2016, she says, "Do not allow our lands to turn into Haiti. Time to shut the savage beasts down. Shut down Black Lives Matter." So there's this claim to, that the U.S. is being reduced to the status of what she sees as a horrific country. There's this claim that a certain type of human being of a certain skin color should be equated with savage beasts and so forth. So it seems like a negative orientation. And she also says in the White Lives Matter mission statement, there are ways we as citizens and owners of our fate can take a stand against these plagues on our people, promoting white genocide by opposing racially mixed couples, homosexuality, diversity, immigration, and tolerance. So you can see that this claim, White Lives Matter, while it might look, if you just detach it from its context, it might look innocuous and true. I mean, it is, in fact, true that white lives matter. You can see that the valuation that people like Rebecca Barnett are espousing looks like a clear case of what I was calling the negative orientation claim. So it looks like appeals to the status or the legitimacy of the evaluative judgment don't allow you to draw that negative-positive distinction. So in light of all of that, it might look futile to distinguish what I was calling positive and negative evaluative orientations, because after all, these four attempts to draw the distinction, it looks like they're all problematic. Moreover, it looks like any positive evaluation is going to commit you to opposing certain things, to being negative in certain stances. And in many cases, when a person embraces some value, you can describe them either as embracing that value or as disvaluing the contrary of that value, right? So for all those reasons, this negative orientation claim might look problematic. But I think it's not, so I think there's a way of doing this. So if you flip to section 2 of the handout, so I think if we move to considering not evaluative judgments, but instead the psychology of valuing, there's a way in which you can come to draw this distinction. So I think that negative ideals play different psychological roles or involve different psychological processes than do positive ideals. So this will take a couple of steps, but let me walk through this. So the first step is to draw what I think is a familiar distinction to many of you between valuing something and judging something to be valuable. So the core idea is just that those two things are different. I can judge something to be valuable without myself valuing that thing. So for example, I think that I think that opera, I judge that to be valuable, but my life contains no real interaction. I've seen an opera too, but I think it'd be a bit of a stretch to say that I actually value that. I don't myself go to operas. I don't structure my life around that. I don't know a great deal about it. By contrast, I both judge philosophy to be valuable and value philosophy. I do structure my life around philosophy. I have various emotions and dispositions that pertain to it and so forth. So it looks like we often want to say that we don't value everything that we judge to be valuable. right? It's easy to judge, to acknowledge something is valuable, to believe that it's valuable, but valuing that thing is more costly. It involves additional psychological states and processes such that not everything that we judge to be valuable is valued by us, okay? So whereas judging something valuable can involve nothing more than having an isolated belief that the thing is valuable, valuing something is often held to require several states. I've put one proposal in the handout. The first three conditions are ones that people like Sam Scheffler have defended. That fourth condition is one that I think needs to be added on. The details of this don't matter a great deal for my purposes. All that really matters is that there's going to be this distinction between valuing and judging valuable, and that valuing is going to involve certain kinds of emotional capacities and so forth. But let's just use this as a candidate account of valuing. So valuing is going to involve a disposition to experience certain emotions pertaining to the valued item. So for example, when I contemplate philosophy, I have positive emotions directed at good manifestations of philosophy. When I see bad philosophy, or when I read a bad philosophy paper, I find that it bothers me in a way that other things don't, right? So I'm emotionally invested in it. I also have a disposition to experience those emotions as merited, so I don't regard these as just random psychological occurrences that bubble up in me. I actually think they're warranted by the thing that I'm having the emotions toward. Moreover, I have a disposition to treat certain considerations that pertain to the valued item as reasons for action. So if I have an idea about philosophy, I see that as a reason to pursue it and develop it and think about it. If I detect some flaw in an argument that I'm offering, I see there as being a reason to try to fix that, to try to make it better. That need not be the case with things that I merely judge to be valuable. And finally, I have a commitment to engaging with the valued item in relevant ways. So I do philosophy, I read philosophy, I go to philosophy conferences. That's not true of everything that I merely judge to be valuable. So suppose something like that distinction between valuing and judging valuable is in place. So earlier, I was saying that if we operate at the level of a valued belief or judgment, we can't distinguish between positive and negative orientations, but I think at the level of valuing, we can. So here's a quick example. Valuing athletic prowess, let's say. Suppose I'm really into sports, I really value great athletes and so forth. Valuing athletic prowess doesn't need to entail disvaluing athletic mediocrity. It might, I mean it can for some people, but it's perfectly possible for me to experience conditions 1 through 4 with respect to exemplary athletes while being relatively indifferent to people who are bad athletes, right? In other words, it's entirely possible, and I think it's actually routine, for people to be emotionally invested in something without being emotionally invested in its negation or its contrary. To give you another example, if you don't like the athletic one, here's a more consequential one. There are entire religious traditions that basically rest on that kind of distinction. So there's a way of interpreting Christianity that says that, this is obviously simplifying quite a bit, but basically says that you should be devoted to God, but you should not bear antagonistic or hostile relations toward those who are opposed to God. You should still treat them with love and respect and so forth, right? So you can see there that it's entirely possible for someone to be emotionally invested in something, to value something, without being committed to disvaluing its contrary or even things that oppose it. So if valuing an object doesn't entail disvaluing things that oppose, threaten, or undermine the object, then we might have a way of drawing this positive and negative distinction. So let me talk about that a bit more. And I'm going to do this by talking about love and hatred for a moment, just as an example of some emotional states that could ground valuings. So valuing an object is going to entail some kind of attitude toward that which threatens, opposes, violates, or just falls short of the value. Even if I don't disvalue the thing that threatens my values, I might regard it with chagrin or disappointment or dejection, right? So I might have some emotions. But what if those attitudes differ in significant ways? So what if we could draw the distinction between positive and negative evaluations, not just in terms of whether they entail disvaluing, but rather in terms of what type of disvaluing they entail? In particular, what if we could look at certain values and see them as grounded in hatred in a way that other values are not? That's what I'm going to explore. So to talk a bit about this, I need to say a little bit about what hate is. And of course, there's a Well, there's actually not. I was going to say there's a big literature on hate. That's actually not true. There's a massive literature on love, and there's a much smaller philosophical literature on hate. But I'm going to just touch on a tiny portion of that literature. I want to draw this distinction that Gene Hampton introduces between simple hatred and spiteful hatred. So let's understand simple hatred as just being strongly averse to something and having that accompanied with the wish to eliminate or remove it. So I manifest simple hatred if I have this strong aversion to something and want to get rid of it or eliminate it. So there's some, let's say there's some type of food that I hate and it's put in front of me. I'm not just averse to it, I want it away. I want the person to get it away from me. Or that reaction could be directed at a person. If you hate someone, you might not just be strongly averse to them, but you might want them away from you. You want not to be around them. In the extreme case, you want to eliminate that person. That's distinct from what you might call spiteful hatred. So spiteful hatred also contains animosity toward an object, but rather than seeking to eliminate or remove the object, it's accompanied by a desire to harm or exert power over that object. And that's actually a crucial distinction, because notice that if you want to harm or exert power over something, you need to keep it around. So simple hatred involves wanting to get rid of or eliminate something. Spiteful hatred involves wanting to keep interacting with that thing so that you can harm it, so that you can exert power over it, or something of that sort. So that's one feature. I'm going to be talking about spiteful hatred in a moment. But I want to point out that hatred, like love, tends to be motivationally overriding. It tends to be one of our stronger motivations. It's not, hatred is not a mild psychological state. It tends to be quite strong. I can say more about that in the discussion if people want to. I also think an important feature of hatred and love is that they're self-sustaining and often self-heightening. So there are some emotions or affects that extinguish themselves pretty rapidly. So surprise only lasts for a second. If something startles me, I get surprised, but then a second or two later, it's over. There are other emotions that are longer lasting. So grief doesn't, if I claim to be in grief just for a second, something would be going wrong, that I'd be misunderstanding what it is to grieve or something, or I'd be psychologically peculiar. So emotions have different temporal lengths. But in addition to that, some emotions seem to be self-sustaining and even self-heightening. So there are certain motives or affects that when they're engaged with, the engaging with them doesn't diminish them or put them into abeyance, but rather seems to heighten them, or at least to sustain them. So if you think about what it is to, for example, be in love with someone, it looks like one thing that love motivates you to do is to continuously engage with the person in a way that shows you ever more reasons to love them, right? You find new details of that person or that person's interests. You get captivated or absorbed by that person. Hatred can be like that too. When I hate somebody, I can be attentively fixated on that person. I can, or that group, I can find all these things that the group is associated with, or all new details of the group, that cause the hatred to be sustained, or in some cases even to grow. So I can say more about that, but I think one important feature of our psychological life is that there's this distinction between desires and affects or emotions that, when acted upon, extinguish themselves, complete themselves, and ones that, when acted upon, tend to grow, or at least to sustain themselves. And I think that if we introduce that distinction, love and hatred are going to be on the second half of that dichotomy, right? So in addition to that, and I realize I'm going over this quite quickly, I can talk about these points more in discussion if people would like. In addition to that, love and hatred both involve an attentive focus, sometimes even a fixation on their objects. That can lead to a narrowing of your other interests. So think about what it is to fall in love with somebody. Often, I hope everyone's had this experience, but often when you fall in love with somebody, everything else recedes into the background, right? You're sort of exclusively focused on her, at least for a while. All of your interests and energies are sort of drawn in there. Hatred, I think, can be like that as well. If you genuinely hate someone or some group, that can narrow. Everything else can recede into the background while that becomes your exclusive focus, at least for a while. Other concerns can be pushed to the periphery. Now, loving and hating are both forms of valuing. So if you think about what I've been saying about love and hatred, you can see that they easily fulfill those four conditions for valuing that I noted above. But we can distinguish between disvaluing something through hatred and disvaluing something as a result of, for example, loving or being positively disposed towards something else. So let me just say that again, because that's going to be the crucial distinction. It's one thing to disvalue something through hatred, and it's another thing to disvalue something as a result of, for example, loving something else. So I'll give you an example of that. Here's a simple example. Suppose that I find, let's imagine two people, and imagine that both of these people are sort of anti-capitalist or anti-materialistic. They both think that there's something wrong with the pursuit of wealth, material wealth, right? One person hates the pursuit of wealth. So one person meets all these conditions that I was just specifying for hating like ostentatious displays of wealth, or people who devote themselves to careers that are, geared merely at material acquisition and so forth. Another person disvalues the pursuit of wealth, but they disvalue it because they love something else. Let's say they love philosophy, just to pick an example with resonance for a lot of us. So, philosophy is not the most lucrative of careers. Many of us could be doing something else that would make a lot more money. Some of us might even have a sort of contemptuous or at least some kind of disvaluing attitude toward purely materialistic pursuits. But you could do that without displaying the kind of disvaluation of wealth that would be present in the person who hates the pursuit of wealth, right? So you can be relatively indifferent to the pursuit of wealth. You can look at it as something that doesn't captivate you in the way that philosophy does, that doesn't engage your motivational interests and so forth, but not something that you sort of attentively fixate upon, that overrides other concerns and so forth. It can be a peripheral concern in your life where your central occupations and energies can be directed at philosophy. So if you think about examples like that, it looks like there's this distinction between two ways of disvaluing something. One way of disvaluing something is by having that disvaluation manifest, for example, in a form of hatred. When that happens, the thing that you disvalue is going to be a central preoccupation, and it's going to have these other features that I was just running through with respect to hatred. And then there's the kind of disvaluation that's a mere consequence of valuing something else, where it could but needn't involve this sort of fixation, this sort of investment of motivational resources and so forth. Okay, so that's the distinction I'm going to be working with. I hope that makes sense. Now, if we focus on that distinction, if we focus on the way in which certain kinds of valuings, for example, those grounded in hate, operate, then I think we can clarify that idea of negative orientation that I started the talk with. So the idea is going to be that loving or hating would unify the person around central concerns, and those concerns would not be substitutable. So the person who hates some group is not going to be appropriately described as, for example, loving or being positively disposed toward the contrary of that group. You can think about the wealth example to make that point a bit clearer. There's a crucial difference between the person who hates materialistic acquisition of wealth and the person who disvalues it, but merely as a consequence of, say, loving something else, right? Those are going to be quite different. And I think that sort of thing shows up in the initial two examples that I gave you guys. So if you think about these Alice and Alan examples, so Alan's ideology, Alan was the incel, who I talked about at the beginning. Alan's ideology and personality seem to be rooted in a form of hatred, whereas Alice, who's the person who initially values art reactively, but then goes to value it for its own sake, she moves from having valuations grounded in a form of hatred of a social group to values grounded in appreciation of the object of that valuation. All while holding her evaluative judgment constant, right? So the evaluative judgment, the content of it remains constant, but the valuings that ground it differ across time. So if we could make sense of the idea that certain kinds of evaluative outlooks or certain kinds of ideologies generate hateful valuations and others don't, then I think that would help us to draw this distinction that I was putting in terms of this negative orientation claim. So in other words, the ideologies or the evaluative outlooks that generate loving valuations, or it wouldn't even have to be, love is just an example here. It could also be other positive affects. But the ideologies or evaluative outlooks that generate, for example, loving valuings would be positive, and the ones that generate hateful disvaluings would be negative. That would be one way of making sense of this claim. Now, The trouble is this. So I began with this puzzle about whether we can make sense of the idea that I presented as both intuitive and as grounding this talk of grievance politics and politics of resentment and so forth. Whether we can make sense of the idea that certain evaluative outlooks or certain personalities or identities are negatively oriented, whereas others aren't. Now, if we're going to do that, we would need to think about how evaluative outlooks or ideologies might interact with the psychologies of individual agents. Because notice that this stuff about valuings that I've been going over has been about the psychologies of individual agents. Whereas the stuff I started out with, the talk of grievance politics and the politics of resentment, those are group level phenomena. So if we want to say that like incel morality is negatively oriented, that's a claim about a group level phenomenon. It's not a claim about the psychologies of individual agents, except insofar as the psychologies relate to the group phenomenon. So that's what I want to talk about now. I want to talk about how those moralities or evaluative outlooks or ideologies, whatever you want to call them, would interact with the psychologies of individual agents. And I want to think about whether particular sets of evaluative judgments are somehow likely to generate either positive or negative orientations in their adherents, perhaps, for example, by generating loving or hateful focal points in their proponents. So there's a general problem with that, though. The general problem with it is just that two people with the same sets of evaluative beliefs can have very different valuings. I mean, Alice, my example of the person who loves art but starts out by generating that reaction or that valuation reactively, that's a temporal example of that thing, right? So Alice at time 1 and Alice at time 2, they have the same evaluative judgments, but different valuings. And if you want a like cross-personal example of this, go back to the White Lives Matter example. As a matter of fact, the people who talk about how white lives matter tend to be people who are, through that judgment, expressing this sort of hateful stance. But you can imagine that in a different social context where the terms don't have that connotation, it's just true that white lives do matter. And you can imagine that being an evaluative judgment that doesn't express this sort of hateful form of disvaluing, right? So the general problem is that two agents with the same set of evaluative beliefs could have different valuings. So how do we make sense of that? So the incel example that I started with is interesting, and I'm going to use that as a sort of paradigm case of the phenomenon I'm interested in. So the incel ideology, if you think about how it goes, it basically offers a story like this. It identifies a group of people and labels that group of people as bad, and gives you a reason why they're bad. They're bad because they're responsible for wronging you, for generating your suffering or your disaffection. And it gives you a path to recovery. It says you can be good by opposing that group in various ways. Right, so the general structure is that it gives us a story that says these people are bad because they're responsible for your suffering, and you can be good by opposing them. But we're trying to counteract that, right? So I take it that the incel example is familiar, so I won't say too much about the details of it. But notice that what happens with the incel narrative is that it gets a grip on people like Alan, in my original example, who experience a kind of disaffection or dejection or disappointment, who experience a lot of aversive motivational states and emotions. Initially, those states don't need to be experienced as wrongs. So it's entirely possible for my life just to be unsuccessful and for that not to be anyone's thought. And presumably, lots of people think about themselves in that way. So I assume there are lots of socially isolated people who take the social isolation to be their own fault or just the result of bad luck or something like that, but not to be something that's done unjustly to them by other people or by feminist ideology or whatever the incels want to blame for it, right? So that's what Alan is supposed to be like that in the initial moments of my example. So in the initial moments, Alan is just supposed to be some guy who's sort of unhappy with his life. His life has turned out badly, and he has a negative self-conception because of that. It's disappointing that he doesn't have close relationships, that he's incapable of forming friendships and romantic relationships and so forth. But the incel narrative interacts with that. The incel narrative says this disaffection and dejection and disappointment that you're experiencing is not your fault. It's not a result of your personal failings. It's the result of this oppressive structure that's present in society. And when that happens, insofar as Alan believes that, it has an interesting effect on his psychological states. So a couple of things happen. One thing that happens is that things that were formerly experienced as a series of personal failings get reinterpreted as a social problem, and a solution for that social problem is offered. You can be opposed to those who generate the social problem, essentially. So if we think about the structure of that explanation, this is down in section 3.2 of the handout. If you focus on that story, you can make some points about the basic structure of the explanation that the incel ideology is offering. So it has a couple of steps. So one step is that, as I've just been describing, a group of people like Alan experience these highly aversive states, including sufferings, disaffection and so forth, and also negative self-conception. So he's unable to form a sort of positive image of himself. He regards himself as a failure in various ways. But then he encounters an interpretation which, if accepted, changes his beliefs and emotions in such a way that the aversive states are transformed into neutral or even attractive ones, and a positive self-conception is enabled. So the disaffection that he's experiencing is a sign that he's not one of these men who have just conformed to social norms and had their desires and personalities shaped by these pernicious forces. That's what he's going to tell himself, right? So the fact that he feels like an outcast, the fact that he's had a lack of success, is reinterpreted as something that counts in his favor. It shows that he's this autonomous individual who has not been corrupted by the feminist ideology and so forth. He hasn't melded his desires to that ideology. And then he can think of himself positively in those terms, right? So the interpretation works in part by offering a target for negative affects and a path to restitution. So Alan now has a target for these negative affects. He can hate or disparage or resent women and feminism. In various ways, he can do things. He can vent his energies through online posting or opposition, or in the worst case, through outright violence against women. So he gets this path to at least potential restitution. And one thing that I want to focus on now is what happens when the perceived wrongs are corrected. Imagine that we get to a point where these perceived wrongs are corrected. There seem to be two possibilities. One possibility is that the correction of the perceived wrongs would alleviate the original first-order sufferings and negative self-conceptions, right? So maybe if Alan were able to bring about this social change that he wants, where some form of patriarchy is reestablished and so forth, maybe that's going to make him feel quite good. Maybe that'll, it'll obviously be bad for a number of reasons and for a number of people, but maybe for Alan, that'll solve the problem. Or maybe it won't. So maybe the correction of the perceived wrongs would just allow the first-order sufferings and the negative self-conception to return. That seems like another possibility. And that seems more likely when the narrative or the ideology that the person is embracing is misguided or fanciful in various ways, when, for example, it either misidentifies the causes of suffering or the potential paths to a way out of that suffering, right? So I could say more about those points. I guess I'll say more about them in discussion, because I don't want to go over the time. But the basic idea here, just to say a few words, is that, let's see, I guess I'll just say that, well, actually, let me just say that first. I'll say more in discussion if people want to talk about those points. Let me skip to section 3.4 of the handout, or sorry, 3.3 of the handout. So I want to now talk about a particular way that what on the penultimate page of the handout is labeled 4B, a particular way in which we could get this ideology that points in the direction of correcting perceived wrongs, but were those perceived wrongs to be corrected, the original suffering and negative self-conceptions would not be alleviated. I want to point to a way in which that can happen. And I want to point to it by focusing on what I've elsewhere called narratives of ressentiment. So let me talk a little bit about ressentiment and the difference between ressentiment and ordinary resentment. So ordinary resentment, as philosophers normally use the term, is typically understood as a kind of indignation that results from the belief that you were wronged. So in other words, what it is for me to resent someone is for me to have a kind of anger or indignation directed at them, but not just that. I also have to think that that springs from a wrong being done to me. So you insult me, I get angry because I think you've wronged me. That constitutes resentment. There's this other thing that initially sounds like resentment. Ressentiment is just the French word for resentment. But it acquired a special technical sense. So Nietzsche introduced this term using it, he's writing in German, but used the French term rather than the German equivalent. And then other people like Max Scheler and a number of other philosophers and psychoanalysts and so forth have employed this term of ressentiment, marking a distinction between it, ressentiment, and ordinary resentment. So what's the difference between resentment in its ordinary form and this special thing, ressentiment? So I think that ressentiment, as people like Nietzsche and Scheler and others use it, has 4 key features that I've listed on the handout. So one of them is that it involves what Gene Hampton calls spiteful hatred, the form of hatred I talked about earlier. In fact, Hampton references Nietzsche when introducing that form of hatred, references the stuff on ressentiment. So spiteful hatred, remember, differs from simple hatred in that simple hatred involves both a strong aversion to something and the desire to get rid of it or eliminate it, whereas spiteful hatred, you've got the strong aversion, but you want to harm or exert power over its object. So ressentiment is going to involve spiteful hatred directed at a person or group that the subject takes to be wronging him. So if we go with the Allen example, Allen is going to manifest spiteful hatred toward women and feminism. In other words, he's not just strongly averse to those things, but wants to harm or exert power over those things. It also involves a feeling of impotence. So ordinary cases of resentment can occur in contexts that do enable immediate responses. So for example, if you insult me or step on my foot or something like that, I might get resentful and just like shove you off or like say something to you, or maybe you just apologize and it's all over right away, right? So the thing gets extinguished almost as soon as it begins. But ressentiment is supposed to be a state that involves the perception that you're unable immediately to respond to the perceived wrong or slight. So an essential feature of ressentiment, as opposed to ordinary resentment, is it involves this feeling of impotence or powerlessness. You might have some future in which you can envision exerting power or expressing hatred toward the person you take to be wronging you, but you can't do that right now. So it's postponed. That sort of reaction is postponed. It also persists. So I talked earlier about how hatred and love seem to be self-sustaining and perhaps even self-heightening emotions. Ressentiment is like that as well. So one key feature of ressentiment is that unlike ordinary resentment, it keeps itself going. So ordinary resentment just seeks restitution, right? If you insult me, I just want an apology. I just want you to make good on it, and then it's all over. Ressentiment is not supposed to be like that. It's supposed to be something that motivates a continuous brooding over the perceived wrong that can involve even a kind of self-heightening form where I seek out new ways in which I'm being wronged or new aspects of the wrong. And for that reason, ressentiment aims not at rectification of the wrong, but at harming of the wrongdoer. That's why it manifests the form of spiteful hatred. So in ressentiment, what I want is not so much to rectify whatever wrong I'm experiencing, but to exert power over or to harm the wrongdoer. So that's just supposed to be definitional. These are just supposed to be some claims about how this concept of ressentiment is supposed to be understood and how it's supposed to differ from ordinary resentment. But notice that incel ideology gives ressentiment an opportunity to be expressed in a particular way. It justifies that resentment and it makes it alluring, right? So in doing so, it's going to promote continued expression of ressentiment. And not only that, it also makes ressentiment, which might otherwise be this peripheral thing that disappears after a while, into a central preoccupation of the person's life, right? By focusing on these putatively oppressive structures. So what's interesting there is that the states that give rise to ressentiment, for example, in the incel case, are widespread. They're things that we all experience from time to time. So everyone will experience at least some occasions on which they feel slighted or inefficacious or unable to get what they want or have some doubts about whether their status is being acknowledged in the right way, whether their value is being perceived, and so forth. So what incel ideology seems to do is to interact with those tendencies, encouraging them to heighten rather than to fade, and to find new targets and new forms, and to seem to be justified, to seem to be warranted rather than unwarranted. And by encouraging these hateful or resentful reactions toward a particular group, what happens is that these aversive feelings of impotence are transformed into these attractive feelings of superiority, right? That seems to be part of what's going on with Allen. But the problem with this sort of method is that because the form of hatred that's being generated here is spiteful, because what it aims at is not the elimination of the detested object, but the harming or the exerting power over the detested object, it's dependent on the persistence of the hated object, right? So the hated object can't really be eliminated or fully overcome because its existence is necessary to sustain this hateful form of valuing and thereby to assuage the person's feeling of impotence, right? So were the incel to overcome, for example, the initial sexual frustration, if this is rooted in a form of spiteful hatred, if it's rooted in ressentiment, for example, then the underlying sense of disaffection would return because the attainment of the sexual partner wouldn't assuage the original feeling of impotence. So the ressentiment fueling interpretation would generate that form of attachment. It would generate an attachment that manifests this form of spiteful hatred. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So just two quick remarks on that. So the ressentiment fueling interpretation would be what I've elsewhere called a narrative of ressentiment. And narratives of ressentiment could be understood as these narratives that have the functional role of stoking ressentiment, encouraging it to emerge, by, for example, identifying a generalized aversive condition and then offering an interpretation of that aversive condition that transforms it into something attractive. So they take something that might initially be diffuse or even peripheral, and they fixate the person on that state, encouraging the person to experience it more often and more centrally for it to become a real fixation or preoccupation for the person. And moreover, these ressentiment narratives tend to become all-encompassing in that they treat the central failings of one's life, so Allen's sense of disaffection and dejection and so forth, as traceable to some singular root cause. Your identity becomes bound up with the expression of ressentiment towards some object. In the incel case, this is toward women and feminism, making it hard to escape. So I can say more about that in the Q&A, but let me say a few more words before I conclude and tie this back into the negative orientation claim. So this is now in section 3.4. So one thing that's interesting about these ressentiment narratives is that they make the object of hatred less important than the expression of hatred. So the object is relatively fungible. In the incel case, it could be a particular woman, it could be women in general, it could be men who conform to the dominant, what the incel thinks are the dominant stereotypes. It could be widespread social norms. It could even be incels, former incels who managed to escape from inceldom. So if you read some of these incel narratives, you find just the most diverse array of targets for their hatred and so forth. And what's interesting about this is that what seems to be going on in these sorts of ideology is that the expression of this form of spiteful hatred becomes tremendously important, plays an important psychological role for the person. The thing that the hatred is directed toward becomes comparatively less important. So let me make that point by distinguishing three different ways in which you could be aggrieved, three different ways in which you could take yourself to be wronged. So suppose you distinguish identities that are formed and sustained through a sense of victimhood on the one hand, and those that are formed and sustained through ordinary hatred on the other. And then third, those that are formed and sustained through ressentiment or spiteful hatred. So in victimhood and in ordinary hatred, you can at least imagine a path to restitution. The identity can be rooted in an ideal that doesn't depend on the maintenance of those forms of oppression or damage to the self. It could be rooted, for example, in an ideal like equality, freedom, or mutual respect. So you could imagine a social group that actually is being oppressed and that forms a conception of itself as oppressed, but were the oppression to be rectified, that would drop out of the group's self-conception. But an identity that's rooted in ressentiment or spiteful hatred would be different, insofar as the identity is not just accidentally, but is essentially tethered to the activity of damage or harm or condemnation. The elimination of one target would just require the agent to find a new target, right? Because what's essential here is the continuous expression of the spiteful hatred rather than the particular object that it finds. And I think this doesn't only happen when the putative wrongs are imaginary, but I think it's clearest when the putative wrongs are imaginary. So an example, I'll give you two quick examples before wrapping up. One example would be the incel ideology, which I've been talking about. Another would be certain kinds of political commentators, like Tucker Carlson is a good example if you're familiar with him. So this is a right-wing commentator in the US who basically, he was originally on Fox News and is now on Twitter or X, and has these shows that basically find a bunch of different targets for resentment or for grievances. He rails against things like COVID vaccines or environmental regulations or immigrants or trans people or Ukraine support. The thing he rails against varies from day to day, but the arguments have a common form. They basically have the form that I was attributing to narratives of resentment earlier, where you identify a putative wrong and take that wrong to be tremendously important, to be responsible for all of the sufferings that a certain group experiences and so forth. So I think in cases like that, we see that what's aimed at is not so much the rectification of a wrong. So with Tucker Carlson, for example, if one of these things is corrected, it's not like he's going to be happy. It's not like he's going to stop the shtick of like complaining and pointing out grievances. He's just going to find some new target, right? Because what's essential there is the expression of the grievances and the rage rather than the particular objects that they happen upon. I think the incel ideology is perhaps like that as well, and you can see that in the expansive list of grievances. What starts out as a singular problem becomes multifaceted. So that's an example of how, in certain cases of ressentiment or spiteful hatred, what seems to be crucial is not so much the object of hatred, but the expression of the hatred. Okay, so now let me put all that together. So I started out with this idea that characterizations of grievance politics and the politics of resentment, as well as reflection on particular cases, can tempt us to say that certain moralities or certain individuals are negatively oriented, that we can't make sense of, then I argued that we can't make sense of that at the level of evaluative judgment, right? However, then I argued that we can make sense of it by turning to the psychology of valuing when we think about what it is to value something. We can do that, for example, by distinguishing between the values that are grounded in a form of spiteful hatred on the one hand, and valuings that are not grounded in that way, valuings that are grounded, for example, in love or other sorts of positive affects on the other hand. And then the idea there would be that, for example, insofar as a valuation is grounded in spiteful hatred, it fulfills that negative orientation claim on the first page of the handout. If it doesn't, if it's not grounded that way, if it's grounded, for example, in love or in some more diffuse negative state, it may not meet that condition. So that would give us a way of drawing the distinction at the individual level. But then in the last part of the talk, I've been wondering how we would apply it to these group level dynamics. So suppose it's true that by appealing to individual psychology, you can draw this distinction for particular people. Would it still make sense to talk about particular ideologies, for example, incel ideology, or various right-wing ideologies like the ones expressed by Tucker Carlson? Would it make sense to speak of those as negatively oriented? I've argued that it would, insofar as, for example, they generate narratives of resentment which transform disaffection into a form of spiteful hatred. That's a particular example, but the general point would be that insofar as we can make sense of an ideology or a narrative as generating spiteful hatred or ressentiment in its adherents, then it would make sense to characterize that ideology as negatively oriented, in terms of that negative orientation claim on the first page of the handout. Okay, so I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to your questions.